Welcome back. This week, our focus is the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement was tremendously influential in the general Protestant outlook at the time of the formation of the United Church of Canada, and it has continued as a significant driver of our life together throughout the history of the United Church of Canada. As we have seen in previous weeks, the various Protestant denominations in Canada struggled to adjust their styles of ministry in response to a series of social changes. Those social changes included rapid urbanization, the growth of an industrial poor, urban growth, the arrival of populations that were diverse in background, culture, language, and religion. These challenged the essentially small town and rural methods that the Protestant denominations had developed over the decades of being in existence in Canada. And different responses were tried, but the one that tended to predominate was the establishment of social agencies tied to the churches. The largest single focus in pre and post World War I era was that of temperance. And this was a subject that united both liberal and conservative religious groups. We see a Canadian branch of the women's Christian temperance movement being established in 1874. We need to understand that temperance is not simply about the consumption of alcohol. The concern was that the consumption of alcohol, perhaps particularly the overconsumption of alcohol, was directly tied to the welfare of children and the integrity of home life. And high rates of alcoholism, particularly amongst the working poor, were seen as a threat to both. And so these concerns were high on the agenda of both social gospel supporters and evangelists. Temperance was also typical of several movements in that time. Social movements that were also directed towards private action and individuals taking personal responsibility. The waterfront of general church life was also changed in the 1880s when the Salvation Army arrived in Canada. Salvation Army is an outgrowth of Methodism with tremendous background in providing ministry to the urban industrialized poor from a religious background. And so they brought lots of experience into this, what was for the Canadian denominations largely a new reality. But the other denominations did not leave the field entirely to the Salvation Army. They engaged in the establishment of urban, social, and community centers. There are lots of examples. One, for example, is in Winnipeg. Methodist Dolly McGuire began by conducting a Sunday school for immigrant children. And Sunday school in this era is not about particularly about religion. A Sunday school is a place where children through the church can learn basic literacy. Sunday being the only day that immigrant children might realistically have free from labor. But this Sunday school rapidly expanded to providing assistance in a wide variety of areas to the new immigrants that were streaming into the western part of the country. And so by 1893, McGuire was also overseeing a several times weekly prayer meetings, medical clinics, an employment bureau, and a night school. All of these were areas in which the churches had not traditionally been involved, but because of the need, they were being drawn into this missional work. Similarly, in Toronto, Walmer Road Baptist Church sponsored a similar sort of mission under Nellie McFarland, doing many of the same sorts of things. By 1912, it was ministering to as many as 7,000 people a month. These are significant numbers of people. After the turn of the 20th century, many of the Protestant denominations created or recreated the office or the order of deaconesses. This was particularly um, for women who wanted to work as urban missionaries. The call to mission was quite strong in that era. Many women and men, but particularly women, felt the call to go and serve as missionaries. This gave an opportunity for people, for women, to be missionaries in their own country rather than traveling abroad. The deaconess movement was never entirely satisfactory, as it was never really clear where these devoted women fit in the whole church hierarchy. They were certainly never adequately paid for the demanding work that they undertook. However, this provided one way for women to address the changed needs of an increasingly urbanizing society. So what is the social gospel movement? Well, the social gospel movement is the name, it's an umbrella name given to an informal and loosely organized force that was active from roughly 1880 to the start of the Depression in the 1930s. It was by no means centered in a particular place or a particular denomination. Rather, it represented a broad Christian response to rapid social change. Unlike the stereotypical evangelical response of the day, which tended to focus on individuals, the social gospel movement was grounded in an analysis of corporate entities and institutions. The social gospel movement develops the notion of social sin. And the origins of the social gospel movement are found in the traditional evangelical concern for personal holiness, coupled together with the newer scientific study of social actions, social problems, and organizations. For the social gospel movement to have come about, it required the rise of the modern North American university, which provided some of its most capable theoreticians. And these folks produced a tidal wave of books which were both scholarly and popular. For instance, the author of Washington Gladden, who wrote the hymn, O Master, Let Me Walk with Thee, also published the book Working People and Their Employers in 1876 as an appeal for justice for laboring folk. At the other end of this spectrum, Charles Sheldon wrote In His Steps in 1897, which suggested that all social problems would be solved if only people would ask in each situation, what would Jesus do? Perhaps you remember those wristbands, WWJD. That's where the phrase comes from. The most important American theorist of the social gospel was Walter Rauschenbusch, who lived from 1861 to 1918, and who, after his ordination, ministered in New York City's Hell's Kitchen for over 10 years before becoming a professor at Rochester seminaries. His first-hand experiences made him a profound critic of the economic order. And so, as a result, he published a series of works that combined social and economic analysis with a thorough application of the biblical prophetic call to justice, combined with a commitment to build the kingdom of God through the power of Christ. In the United States, the social gospel was often associated with more liberal trends in Bible and theology. In its earliest manifestations in Canada, however, the social gospel was tied to evangelical traditions and the application of gospel convictions to issues and institutions. So we find an international movement with a particularly Canadian expression, which focused both on moral reform campaigns and efforts to assimilate immigrants at the same time as addressing very real social and economic and labor justice issues. One way to talk about the Canadian expression of the social gospel movement is to tell the stories of some people, and we could choose many of those, and I want to introduce you to some of them. The first is a father and son duo, the Wordsworths. They are indicative of the connection and the disconnect of the social gospel movement with what came before it. Both of them were named James Wordsworth, although to avoid confusion, the elder was called James and the younger J.S. James, the father, was once described by S.D. Chown, who was later a moderator of the United Church of Canada, as a man with, quote, the prophet's vision of the possibility of this continent-wide dominion of Canada, and of the organization strategy by which her resources will, with increasing lavishness, be distributed for the benefit of the whole world. End of quote. J.S., the son, was described by historian Kenneth McNaught as, quote, a man whose greatest achievement was his constant battle against institutional conformity. James Wordsworth, the father, was known for his incredible endurance in the great project of missionary expansion in Western Canada. In 1888, he was appointed as the superintendent of Methodist missions for Manitoba and the Canadian North. And his diaries record incredible tales of travels through difficult terrain for the sake of spreading the gospel. For example, he simply records after a tour of Methodist missions in Alberta, we have just covered 800 miles by buckboard. In other words, horse and wagon. He was also a strong promoter of church union as a vehicle for both evangelism and for church expansion. J.S., the son, inherited his father's passion for travel and for vivid writing, but he was never the enthusiastic church supporter that his father had been. He never owned more than 2 suits at any time and never smoked or drank. Before his final resignation from ministry, he actually resigned 2 previous times, in 1902 and 1907, and the Methodist Church proved to be flexible theologically, if not politically, in its willingness to accommodate this theological rebel. J.S. had an incredible capacity to live himself under the skin of other people. His letters and articles in public media reveal his horror at the poverty of orphan boys in London, the squalor of Edinburgh slums, or the injustice of the premature death of a baby in Western Canada. He records choking on the traditional words of the funeral, quote, for as much as it has pleased Almighty God in God's wise providence to take unto himself this child, end of quote, when he said it was not God, but bad housing and bad milk that had killed her. While James the father was very aware of the reality and problems of poverty, he also acknowledged that he could not advise his son J.S. about the so-called newer problems of urban poverty, and industrialization. These were problems, challenges of a sort and a scope that was beyond the traditional thinking of the churches. Canadian Methodism in those days, around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, was characterized by a division between East and West. Wealthy Eastern Methodist families, such as the Eatons, the Burtons, and the Flavels, and you can find those names attached to buildings and institutions across the country. These Methodist families often lived by the conviction that thrift and hard work were the marks of God's election. Western Methodists, such as J.S. Woodsworth and Salem Bland, who we'll meet in a moment, and others, were characterized by a more egalitarian and socially nonconforming tradition. Wordsworth and the others were incensed by the brutality of life in the primitive capitalist jungle, especially as that reality was exacerbated by the hinterland status of the West. The West really was a wild place, and all sorts of things happened as people rushed in to take up the wealth of the land. So in 1907, he began his work at the All People's Mission in Winnipeg. And it was there that J.S. Woodsworth's fame as a social justice champion was established. He worked amongst immigrants. He created the People's Forum, the Associated Charities of Winnipeg. He agitated successfully against the excesses of the First Juvenile Court. He organized the Social Welfare League. In part, his radicalization was spurred by his frustration at the rescue mission orientation of the All People's Mission in the face of the hugely growing problems of the city. He wanted to address the root of the problem rather than responding to the human destruction that was being created at the other end. He became increasingly opposed to short-term solutions and adopted justice, not charity, as his motto. J.S. Woodsworth later resigned from the ministry when his pacifism was denounced by other Methodists during World War I. His was an interesting pacifism. It was not based on idealism, but it was in clear opposition to the mountains of wealth being accumulated by arms dealers. He believed that distributive justice could only be achieved in a peaceful, sharing society. As a result, he espoused in Canada the British Labour Party position that called for the general elimination of the control of industries by capitalists through political means. This was to be accomplished by increasingly heavy taxation. Woodsworth recommended that small incomes not be taxed at all, while the largest would be taxed at 95%. Remember, we're talking in the period 1910 to 1920. After leaving ministry, J.S. Woodsworth worked as a stevedore on the Vancouver docks. He believed that the purpose of production was its usefulness, not personal profit. And so, at the time of the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, an apprentice was earning 10 cents an hour. The average construction worker earned $915 per year, while the basic needs of a family of 5 were judged to be $1,503. In other words, even the hardest working, fully employed construction worker could not bring in enough money to support a family of 5. These and other intolerable conditions led to a series of rotating strikes that began in May 1st, 1919. This is the Winnipeg General Strike. That called for improved wages and working conditions. The General Strike itself started on the 15th of May with sympathy strikes in several western cities. On June the 6th, despite any absence of violence on behalf of the strikers, the mayor of Winnipeg forbade parades and public gatherings. Wordsworth, who had quit his Vancouver job in protest of loading arms and ammunition to send to Russia to fight the Bolsheviks, and had come to Winnipeg, he was arrested on June 25th as the last wave of labor leaders incarcerated and released after 5 days. In 1921, he went on to be elected as a member of Parliament for Winnipeg North Centre as a member of the Independent Labour Party. During the Depression, he advocated for socialism as the remedy for Canada's economic and moral crises. So we see in Wordsworth an early example of very much faith-driven interaction with significant social problems brought about by industrialization and unchecked capitalism. We see a recognition that those who have incredible wealth also have a responsibility, and we also see the bringing into the analysis of social challenges a clearly grounded gospel articulation of how the social gospel spokesperson believes God wants life to be, and an appeal to those wealthy members of the churches to actually live into their faith. A second person we might look at is Salem Bland. Salem Bland is an example of the spirituality of the social gospel movement, and it's a reminder that the social gospel commitments went beyond redistribution of wealth. In Bland, we see the struggle to create an appropriate spirituality that was equal to the challenges of the time. And so his quest led from reflection on the nature of the soul to the meaning of culture, and from academic study to social action. Now, Bland arrived in Winnipeg in 1903 to teach church history and New Testament at the Methodist College. He already had a strong reputation, a brilliant preacher, a defender of labor's right to organize. Remember that at this time, unions and unionization were very much new ideas and very, very controversial. He was a proponent of the state provision of cultural amenities, and he was an advocate for social schemes to equalize conditions in society, various forms of government legislation, government contributions, and so on. He was also an active prohibitionist, an opposition of the sale of liquor, and he had been the president of the Lord's Day Alliance in Ottawa. He was also a strong advocate of church union. The major social challenge that faced Christians in the developing West in Canada was a seemingly all-consuming material passion evoked by commodities such as furs and wheat. And the drive to extract these resources brought many immigrants to the territory. It happened that the same train that brought Bland to Winnipeg was also an immigrant train carrying 140 Hungarians and Galatians to a new home. Growing harvests of wheat brought farm machinery dealers, bankers, insurance, marketing, and investors. Wheat created a financial revolution that had the effect of pulling Western Canada into the modern world of commercial and industrial capitalism and subordination to the banking centers in central Canada. Now, many of the most important and wealthiest representatives of banking, investment, and industrialization were also pillars of institutions like the Protestant churches, the YMCA, the Sunday school movement, charities, hospitals, and children's aid. In other words, they were not all motivated by simple greed, and many were generous supporters of institutions designed to aid the needy, but it was aid designed to help those flourish within the system rather than the challenging the system itself. And what the social gospel movement did was challenge the system. These pillars of church and society were committed to highly individualized doctrines of justification by faith and the priesthood of all believers, which meant that they believed that no power should stand between the individual and God. This had over time, though, evolved into a priesthood of property, providing an apparently Christian justification for a structure of economic relations and exploitation that Bland increasingly found to be unchristian in nature. Bland arrived in Winnipeg and wasted no time in starting to share his vision. Within a month of arriving in the city, he was publicly lecturing on the need for Prairie Society to adopt a wider and deeper Catholicity of spirit and the practice of reconciliation. He asked, was it too much to think that on the prairies justice might prevail and common people come into their own? He was prepared to acknowledge that private enterprise had done what public enterprise was either too stupid or too timid to do. He acknowledged that. But rather than surrender entirely to the capitalism and the force of the market, he warned of the utter foolishness of expecting justice to prevail when the pursuit of wealth was the sole priority. He readily acknowledged that material pursuit was vital and urgent, and that true Christian spirituality did not reject it. But he was concerned with the way that the pursuit of wealth was ordered and the impact that that pursuit had on ordinary people. He was another one of these seemingly endlessly energetic social gospel folks, speaking in college classrooms, the YMCA, the regional conferences of the Methodist Church. His students were already familiar with the social gospel. Bland's warning was about the danger of foreclosing on the future and settling for some popular idolatry, the idolatry of the almighty dollar. Regardless of the subject, for Bland the key was relationship. Social change meant finding one's proper relationship to God. Christianity was political as well as spiritual. Winnipeg, like many Canadian urban centres, was facing major tumult due to rapid industrialization and the accompanying growth of a poorly paid working class. So in 1904, the year after his arrival, Bland was part of starting a Winnipeg-based, self-consciously progressive Methodist newspaper. The goal was to urge Methodists to shift away from a purely personal gospel and to recognize the reality of urban divisions and their capacity to make a difference. These multiplying urban issues posed a challenge to the essentially optimistic nature of Bland's social gospel. Winnipeg was a city divided. Foreign immigrants and English-speaking working class were separated from the middle class and the wealthier classes, both economically and physically, by the expansion of the CPR. The poor literally lived on the other side of the tracks. Workers were badly abused by housing speculators, employers, by the writers of the Winnipeg Free Press, all of whom encouraged police crackdown on any form of organizing. Debates over property rights always got in the way of actions on communal diseases such as smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and typhoid. All of these flourished in the incredibly poor slum housing. Bland tried to remain optimistic. It was too easy to only see the negative aspects of the city, he insisted. He saw not only the acquisitiveness, but also the sociability and the possibility for reform and revolution and change. What did that look like? Well, in 1905, he gives his most detailed blueprint for a Christian city. There, using Winnipeg as the example, there were parks and riverbank land reserved for public use, including the poor. There was sanitary reform, municipal ownership of utilities, more and better schools, asylums, and libraries. There were galleries and concerts. There were adequate salaries and recognition of trade unions. He repeatedly castigated the middle class, many of whom were staunch supporters of Protestant churches, for their out of sight, out of mind approach to social problems. He was particularly scornful of middle class liberal Christians who advocated police restraint on issues of prostitution, but wanted to unleash the police with full fury at the slightest line of crimes against property. By 1906, Bland was involved in provincial politics, opposing a wide variety of government policies that exploited the working class. These ranged from liquor sales to the selling of public lands to private developers and the financial support of corporate speculation. This is all part of what came to be known as Christianizing the economic, social, moral, and political order. And Bland also became an advocate for establishing courses on sociology in all universities as a way of expanding general knowledge of the fashion in which society works. He also worked closely with J.S. Wordsworth in the Winnipeg All People's Mission. He saw that as a laboratory for social change. As he became more engaged with the labor movement, his participation in Methodist circles declined. Increasingly, his sermons emphasized the necessity of finding Christ outside the settled and comfortable places of society, the need for Christianity to disentangle itself from the existing economic order, many representatives of which sat in the pews. Our third example of the social gospel movement is Nellie McClung. Responses to Nellie McClung were many and varied, not least because she herself was a complex person who was involved in many different issues. She was born in 1873 in Ontario, but McClung's family moved to Winnipeg in 1880 for homesteading. She was of the generation that was taught that career and homemaking could not mix, so she chose career and headed off to Winnipeg to become a teacher. And it was there that she began to hear discussions about women receiving the vote, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and about prohibition. And she received significant mentoring in the social impact of the gospel from the Reverend J.A. and Annie McClung, and later married their son West in 1896. She quickly became pregnant and waxed eloquent about the discomforts associated with that. Quote, "If pregnancy and morning sickness had been a man's disease, it would have been relieved long ago, but women can suffer. It keeps them humble." End of quote. She began her public engagements speaking to groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and writing Sunday school and devotional pages. She proved quite adept, and she became very popular and much in demand. A typical McClung speech went something like this: "Is our Christian civilization such a boon that we should go out of our way to pass it on to other people? I believe it is, and we should." McClung was drawn into political activism through a local Council of Women meeting. This meeting focused on the employment conditions of female factory workers, and the council appointed McClung and another woman to lobby the provincial government for a female factory inspector. Her tactic was simply to take the premier, who was convinced that there was too much idleness among young women, on a tour of several unventilated, overcrowded, foul smelling basement factories. The premier didn't get the point. His response was to wonder why two respectable young women would want to ferret out such disgusting conditions. Why go looking for those things? Although he did promise to check up on the male factory inspector, he claimed that he had too much respect for women to appoint them to such a position. Through witty and insightful writing and drama, McClung poked holes in arguments so often advanced for the status quo. Her favorite and oft-repeated strategy was to use someone's own words to defeat them. It is also important to remember that church and activism were interwoven in McClung's life. She once told a newspaper that, according to her Christian outlook, missionary work and the movement for women's votes were synonymous. As such, she belongs within the social gospel's optimism that society could be reconstructed and corrected by applying democratic Christian principles. This was evolutionary rather than revolutionary. In a speech in 1914, she called on women to leave behind individual acts of charity and emphasize justice for all. She spoke of her political involvement as being the next step in the way God communicated with God's people. McClung was a social Darwinist. In other words, she anticipated the continued development of the human race. She believed that Christianity could be a significant tool in that continued development. For her, church union was seen as a way of promoting the capacity of the church for effective action. The ordination of women was an important building block in the structure of freedom and equality for women, and McClung was part of the sessional committee at the 1928 General Council that brought forward the motion that there was no bar in religion or reason to the ordination of women to the ministry. She was disappointed by the failure of the church to turn this resolution into timely action. She was discouraged by the very conservative position of the Women's Missionary Society on the question. And the eventual ordination of Lydia Grucci in 1936 left McClung feeling somewhat embittered by the whole debate and the slow speed of the church to act on what seemed to her to be obvious opportunities for reform. There were different denominational responses to the social gospel movement. Methodists embraced it with unmatched fervor, and several important denominational offices in 1906 were filled by ardent social gospelers. They were impacting the entire denomination, so by 1914, the Methodist Board of Evangelism and Social Services could actually declare in its annual report, quote, "It is the business of the church to set up on earth the kingdom of God as a social organization based on the rule of Christ," end quote. And so what we see in this period is Methodist leaders and organizers redirecting their considerable energy from the western frontier, think James Wordsworth, to addressing urban problems, think J.S. Wordsworth, and reaching unchurched workers instead of unchurched pioneers and homesteaders. As such, we see evangelistic fervor being replaced by social zeal while still maintaining Methodism's roots in Wesley's doctrine of Christian perfection. Humanity can be made better. The link between the older form of Methodism and the newer form was prohibition. And in the temperance movement and the prohibition movement, we see the shattering of the previous reservations about the church's involvement in socio-political action. Although concerned for the poor, prohibition was essentially a bourgeois movement. The social gospel leaders were theologically aware. They were plugged into new biblical studies as well as new social studies. By temperament, they were organizers. They were creators of structures and bureaucracies. The ultimate failure of the temperance movement to affect the attitudes of business and working poor hides the real legacy of the social gospel movement. It's found in various agrarian movements that spring up from time to time in Canadian history, such as the CCF, which is a precursor of today's New Democratic Party. And if we move forward into the life of the United Church, we find documents such as you read, like the private control of and profit in the liquor trade, which shows that the General Council is still hostile to the liquor trade, and where elimination is not possible to mitigate harm as far as possible, highly suspicious of private ownership, and the evidence of the growing reach of brewers and distillers into many areas of society. Also willing to look at various aspects of the question. Will public ownership fix this, or will politicians use it as a way to line their own pockets? Public ownership lowers prices, which raises use. Higher prices makes politicians greedy. So could you find a way of funneling these prices into social products? The church argued that there were no legal barriers for change to public ownership. But if the liquor trade is an evil thing, we have to be on guard that it will corrupt the government and the nation. And the eventual conclusion of the report was that opinion was divided and that there was no position that the church could take. Earhart, in her work, focuses on the Protestant principles for organization: administrative staff, centrality in fundraising and allocation, boards with specialized functions, proclaiming the gospel and providing practical assistance is the United Church way in that period of time, growing out of all of the things we've said about the social gospel. The question of how to exercise influence without being politically partisan, which remains a contemporary challenge as well. The rise of the service state, the government's support of various forms of welfare institutions, hospitals, schools, and so on, challenged the United Church. The problem was that the church had the power to initiate, but not the resources to sustain social initiatives. Robert Falconer, in writing Christianizing the Social Order, articulates some really important assumptions about the social gospel movement that still have an impact in the United Church today. The first is that there are Christian principles that should govern the social order. And we can determine the degree to which these are in practice and can create more influence. For example, inequities in income distribution, recurrent unemployment, class conflict, unregulated competition for private gain, and so on. Eugene Forsey shows another sign of the social gospel influenced reflection. He writes that capitalism is not solving the problems of society. Looking across the waters to different countries, socialism seems to be, but He wonders, is socialism the only response? And he proposes a cooperative movement, one member, one vote, resources equitably shared. He wants to replace monopolistic capitalism. Cooperativism to create stability in the price of consumer goods, not fluctuating demands. Cooperativism in heavy industries and utilities that have substantial fixed costs for startup, which leaves the cooperative movement at the mercy of capitalism. So he's not naive about the costs of creating things, and he sees capitalism's role in creating these social and structural institutions. But in the end, he opts for socialism. He sees monopoly capitalism pushing the country towards fascism. He opts for socialism, which is not communism or collectivism, and he wants to see the nationalization of utilities and major industries as a direct outgrowth of social gospel reflection on the economic realities of God's people in God's world. And so we bring that forward into the church today, and we ask questions like, to what extent are our activities charitable, or are they genuinely revolutionary? Are we seeking to bind wounds or limit the number of people who are wounded? Those are the sorts of questions that the social gospel continues to provoke in us, asking us whether or not the gospel that we proclaim is purely individual, or to what extent it has a social implication as well.